I'm Bruce Kane. I'm the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And this is another in our series on California, the West, and in particular today on Monterey County and Cannery Row. And we're very pleased to have one of our Stanford teachers, Carol McKibben, who's been teaching California and Western history here at Stanford. And whose first book was actually on Cannery Row and the workers in Cannery Row. And today she's going to reflect on a different perspective on Cannery Row than the one that John Steinbeck presented in his book. And so we're very pleased to have her do that. Now, let me just say a little bit about the format for those of you who may not have joined us in the past. Carol is going to speak for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And we ask you that you submit the questions either on Q&A or if you want on chat. I will toggle back and forth between the two. And I will field questions. If I see questions that seem to clump together, I will put them together in my own words so that Carol doesn't have to answer the same question over and over again. If there's an occasion that I think is appropriate, I may come in with a question of my own. But for the most part, we want to try to field your questions. So as you listen, feel free to put it into the chat or into the Q&A. And when she's done, we'll get to those questions. And as I said, we will end on the hour as we always do. And we hope that we'll continue to have more California community histories in the future. And so we're very pleased that Carol's going to continue this. We've done a couple already. So I'll hand it over to Carol right now to begin on Cannery Row at its 75.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for the kind introduction. And thank you also to Stephanie Burbank and Preeti Haymeyer and Marco Martinez, all from the Bill Lane Center, for making me feel so welcome. I'm really excited to be here today to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the publication of Steinbeck's Cannery Row and his literary genius, but also to share a view of Steinbeck country from a female and working class perspective. So I'd like to begin by visually going back in time to the 1930s. Marco Martinez put together a great series of photographs from that era that I want to spend just a couple of minutes going through to illustrate what I'm about to discuss. And we can return to them at the end. Marco, might you please share that on the screen? Thank you. So the first slide is a juxtaposition of our books. Now, this is not to say that I'm equivalent to Steinbeck. He was a genius, I'm not. But the covers tell this essential story of perspective. So in his cover, it's about the guys hanging out. But mine is really about these working class women who actually formed the bulk of the workplace in Cannery Row. The next slide is a view of the row, and when we read Steinbeck, this is what we might imagine. It's a pretty dilapidated place in his world, right? Versus this view of Monterey and the ocean, which is taken from Lover's Point. And it might be considered, this is the immigrant perspective. This is what they saw, this beautiful ocean teeming with fish. And it's a big pull factor for immigrant Sicilians. Also clear in the next slide is that this world was not a world of hanging out. This was a world of work. And it is in juxtaposition with Steinbeck's world of play. It's women-centered and it's working class, and above all, it's industrialized. And the next slide shows the same kind of view. This is hard work, women at work. I think there's another one. Right, this multicultural, multi-ethnic working class world. It was a family world too. And the next slide kind of celebrates family, which I'm going to be focused on a lot. And you can see that it's multi-generational, it's exuberant, it's robust, and it's grounded by women. As Monterey transformed, and I'll kind of go into this, you know, a little more detail, culturally into a new ethnic working city. I want you, go to the next slide there, Marco, please. This was the transformation of Monterey represented in Santa Rosalia. And we see how this played out on the wharf and how important and vibrant it became. And I think you have another slide on the boats. Right. And, you know, this big celebration of Italian culture and fishing. Is there one more that shows the crowds at the wharf? Yes. And that is also part of Santa Rosalia, this really claiming space in Monterey. And then the war years, finally, at this point, what we see are not soldiers, but evidence of exclusions, marginalization. And this menacing flyer poster really speaks to the fear of the war years also. So thank you, Marco. We'll come back to this. And I'd like to begin our conversation about Cannery Row. So I'd like to begin first, not with my own words, but with the words of one of the women I interviewed way back when I first published this book. She introduced me to the Italian Catholic Federation, a group of women, by saying, "Thank you, honey, for writing this book. That son of a bitch, Steinbeck, ruined everything for us," which was a little shocking for me. But I also understood exactly what she was talking about. And when we look at those photographs, we also understand that it was a very different world for her. She and they wanted to be seen. They wanted respect, acknowledgement, understanding of their struggle and their power. So in this work of mine, this dissertation I wrote so many years ago, I tried really hard to do that, to give them the respect and recognition that they deserved and that they felt was lacking. And going back to Steinbeck and his brilliant novel, we can see why they might have felt that way. He begins with one of the most memorable paragraphs in American literature, but it also shows something else that's important. It clearly shows what women were angry with him about. Cannery Row is a poem, he wrote, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream. Cannery Row is the gathered and scattered, tin and iron and rust and splintered wood, chipped pavement and weedy lots and junk heaps, sardine canneries of corrugated iron, honky-tonks, restaurants and whorehouses, and little crowded groceries, and laboratories and flop houses. Its inhabitants are, as the man once said, whores, pimps, gamblers, and sons of bitches, by which he meant everybody. Had the man looked through another peephole, he might have said saints and angels and martyrs and holy men, and he would have meant the same thing. Steinbeck's nostalgic Monterey is dilapidated, lazy, neglected. The canneries were something of an afterthought. Women were just the appendages to the main characters and main events of this whimsical story set in the 1930s, but written during World War II to entertain bands of brothers fighting in the Pacific and European theaters. And by everybody, he meant men. Women were there too, however. Neither women nor men, for that matter, were whores or sons of bitches, nor were they saints or angels. They were real live human beings, fully human, whose lives showed just how powerful they could be in building families, in creating new communities, in a strange new world, and finally transforming that world itself. So I came away from my own research with this feeling of awe for what they did. Cannery Row was not the dreamscape of Steinbeck's telling either to the women and families who made up this Sicilian immigrant working class or any of the working class people in Monterey in the early part of the century. I focused so specifically on Sicilians because their demographic predominance in Monterey made them important. And because the feedback I got from non-Sicilian cannery workers suggested that theirs was a story that needed telling on its own. First of all, Sicilian immigrants made up about a third of Monterey's pretty tiny population by the 1930s, and they continue to be this significant minority group in Monterey. There were only 2 families in 1900, but 20 years later, there were 972 Italians, according to the census, out of a population of a little over 6,000. A decade later, by 1930, when Steinbeck was writing, Sicilians numbered a little over 3,000 out of a total population of a little over 9,000, and they've remained about a third of Monterey's population ever since. Now, a common response from former cannery workers of Japanese, Mexican, and Filipino descent to my questions about their work lives in the canneries was that the workforce was divided between Sicilians and non-Sicilians, which made me curious. Plus, my own Sicilian family members gave me an entree into this population. I learned that to former cannery workers generally, but specifically for Sicilians, Monterey in the early 20th century was quite the opposite of what Steinbeck depicted. In Steinbeck's world, women stayed on the sidelines, passively waiting for men to choose them as lovers or wives. Their only purpose was to serve, to wait, to stand by while men took center stage. But women were central in Monterey in that era. They were not peripheral. They were busy, active, in constant motion, and in control, creating new communities and changing the complexion of Monterey in the process. The ocean drew them, this beautiful ocean that we saw a little photograph of, with pristine beaches. It was reminiscent of the Mediterranean and the Sicilian beaches they knew so well, only this one was teeming with fish, while in their Mediterranean, the fish were nearly extinct by the 19-teens, and fishing families were desperate and starving by the 30s. I interviewed over 150 Sicilians on both sides of the ocean for this book. Several recalled in really vivid language the poverty of those years as an impetus for out-migration. One immigrant remembered that in Sicily, children fought over a potato in the street. And fishermen had to go farther and farther out to sea to find a catch. They often returned empty-handed after long, dangerous excursions as far away as North Africa. Sometimes they didn't return at all. The ocean for them was a resource to be harvested. It was not an environment for scientific study, as Steinbeck depicted through the lens of Doc Ricketts. The only recourse for them was to leave, to start over. But where would they go? By 1910s, they were hearing rumors that in Monterey, the fish were so plentiful, they're coming into the houses, which is a pretty big pull. So we see from the beginning this big pull, but also we see women's pivotal role in the processes of immigration and settlement. They were central. Nancy Mangiapane, one woman, explained it to me. Here is how it was, she said. The families came from Italy for a better life. In Italy, there was nothing. So the families all got together. They sent a father or son out first. The women who came because they wanted to keep the families together. They all worked in the canneries here. They took a risk. They were very brave to leave like that. They also argued that in Italy, there was only fishing. Women couldn't work. That was for the men. So that's how the decision happened. And they were brave. Immigration was and is never easy. And it's rarely, if ever, a decision that families make lightly or that people make alone. Women came as men came. They were parts of tightly woven families within households that included several generations of kin. And it was this roar of industry that promised them a way out of their extreme poverty and gave them a new path to a new American world of prosperity and hope, and most importantly, independence for themselves and their children. Monterey wasn't a junkyard. It was not a marginal space that Steinbeck recollected. For them, it was all so beautiful, so modern, so full of everything that embodied the American dream. And yet, the world of industrialized work in the 30s was anything but the easy, casual labor that Steinbeck described when he told the story about the boys finding a little work in the canneries to earn a little money to throw a party for their beloved Doc Ricketts. The women I came to know constituted the bulk of the workforce that made Monterey into an economic powerhouse by the 30s. From almost nothing at the turn of the century, the fishing industry grew into a $50 million enterprise 30 years later, which is almost $1 billion today. And it happened in the context of a regional explosion of industrialization in food production that included the Salinas Valley next door, also famous. Women cannery workers were committed to a regimen of sustained, hard labor. They did not come and go as they pleased, like Mac and the boys. This was not casual labor by any means. They described to me a rigid workplace and a harsh reality. Cannery whistles, a different one for each cannery, called them to work at any hour of the day or night when the boats returned with loads of fish that had to be cleaned and packed immediately. Now, these were teenagers and young mothers who left babies and small children with older siblings or older relatives so they could work. It might be 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning. But if you wanted to keep your job, you dropped everything and got there within 45 minutes. Usually you had to walk. We worked hard was a constant refrain. Women and girls, some as young as 14, remember standing on line for hours and hours and hours in freezing cold canneries, in ankle-deep water, constantly running on the floors, with the machinery so deafening that women often suffered permanent hearing loss. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week for 33 cents an hour. You got fired if you got pregnant. Miscarriages were common and led to all kinds of reproductive problems, even infertility. So were accidents. Can you imagine squeezing the guts out of fish at 3 or 4 in the morning? My Auntie Nina asked me when I was pressing her about the nature of her work. Many described it as hell and dangerous. You had to watch out for each other so you didn't get hurt, because some women got so tired they fell asleep standing up on the job. The smell was awful. And here, Steinbeck had it right. It even got into your hair. Women were ashamed of that when they left work, but they were defiant too. When confronted by Montereyans about the way they smelled, they often responded, "You know what you smell? You smell money." So this world of work was a woman's world, not a man's world. Women were proud of their work and demanded respect for it, which they felt Steinbeck, in his telling of prostitutes, crazy ladies, lazy women who only wanted to be cared for, didn't give them. Being called lazy, by the way, is probably the worst insult in Sicilian culture. They were clearly aware of their exploitation here, and they resented it. They were under the complete control of 4 ladies, almost all of whom were Italian and related. And I can say more about that later if you want. They even timed us when we went to the bathroom, I was told, as an example of their collective feeling of indignity and oppression on the job, which united them across ethnic lines. But to them, Steinbeck's working class prostitutes ignited a horror and a deep fear. God forbid they would be seen as those kinds of working girls. Sicilian cannery workers, even though they shared lunch and camaraderie with other working class women, purposefully maintained a distance and insularity based on ethnicity. And one of the ways they did that was by speaking only dialect, which excluded everyone else. They might have shared their lunches, but that camaraderie ended when they left the workplace at the end of the day. I believe that this distancing had a lot to do with racial ideologies that privileged whiteness in this country. And Sicilians were thrilled to be seen as white. In contrast to their fellow Mexican American and Asian American workers, they wanted to be sure that they held tightly onto that part of their identity. But given these harsh conditions in the context, this was the 1930s. The IWW, the Communist Party, the CIO, these were at peak levels of organization. Longshoremen organized a walkout in San Francisco in 1934, marched up and down the urban West that brought the city to San Francisco to a standstill. In Salinas, where I'm now completing a new book project, Filipinos initially walked out of the lettuce fields in solidarity with women packing house workers, many of whom had come from the Dust Bowl, who demanded equal pay. They didn't get it, but they did get a seat at the bargaining table. Now that walkout, that lettuce strike in 1936 was the catalyst for that brought the city a great notoriety and national attention. And it also led to the famous Lafayette congressional hearings of 1938. So given this context, even locally, I expected to find at least some working class solidarity that would cross ethnic lines, just like Vicki Ruiz did in her analysis of fruit cannery workers in San Jose during the same period. But I didn't. And again, I think part of that came from this deep need to be considered white in the American context. And, you know, in Italy, Sicilians, all Southerners really, were looked at as inferior in relationship to Northern Italians. So they felt that keenly, and they certainly didn't want to ally too closely with anyone of color in the US. So labor union activism, multiracial as it was in the 30s, seemed really dangerous for them, which they expressed. But there was another part to this lack of solidarity. Monterey fish cannery workers did organize in unions, into unions in 1937, but it was over the objections of Sicilian women. And it was complicated by more than just ideas about race in America. Sicilian women, workers in the canneries, were usually related by kin to the owners of the canneries. What is family here? One narrator explained. I will tell you what it became. It became this interlocking network of fishermen by which he met everyone, cannery workers, cannery owners, boat owners, fishing people. There was this intensive activity, he said, intermarriage, so that the community is truly linked by blood. Family was the entire group. Children were raised together as cousins. We had the same values, we had the same traditions, we even had the same thing for dinner every night, which was true. Right down to material possessions. Everyone had the same thing. Well, that really wasn't true. Some people had more than others. There was a lot of jealousy. So that's another story. But it was unthinkable to go on strike against your own family, even your extended family. So instead of organizing or being part of these labor movements, they turned their hardship at work into profit and remade Monterey in their own image in the process, culturally and politically, not just by their labor, but also by the way they lived their lives, formed a common bond and identity, and expressed their culture at home and in the streets. I learned about their power. Women and men, both in Sicily and in Monterey, commonly referred to their families as little matriarchies, which is a word I would not use myself, loaded as it is, but there it was. It was used to explain how critical women's migration decisions were in the first place and the whole pattern and experience of settlement. As I learned more about these families, I began to really appreciate women's economic power beyond earning wages in the canneries. Italian families customarily gave the power of the purse to women. Among fishing families, this was intensified because men were physically out on the ocean, sometimes for weeks and months at a time. Sicilian women immigrants who barely spoke English and had almost no education took advantage of the opportunity to make investments in real estate in Monterey, claiming space in the city rather than buying more and bigger fishing boats as their husbands would have liked. Their intention was to break the pattern of endless migration, of just following the fish, and to settle in Monterey for good, which they expressed over and over again to me. They knew from experience that fishing was precarious, dependent as it was on fragile, capricious ocean environments, and they decided to change course. But not everyone. Plenty of families moved to San Pedro in Southern California, even to South America, and then back to Sicily. But many, many, many more stayed put. And these were the ones that I focused on for that reason. They bought homes. That was a priority for them, scrimping and negotiating their way through. They even bought up whole city blocks in Monterey, using savings from fishing when it was at its most lucrative, sometimes even without first informing their husbands about their plans. Several women told me that they waited for their husbands to go fishing before making a purchase on a home or investment property in Monterey. So I checked and I traced ownership and tax records, and I noted that many of these were in women's names. They really did do that. One woman explained that after her father died, she, not her brothers, took over the family finances for the entire extended family of 4 siblings and their families. I was in charge of investments, she said. I took equity out of one property and put it into malls and shopping centers. I made it grow. It still supports us in the 90s. Another narrator whose husband intended to move the family to South America to follow the fish just kept taking the for sale sign down from their house every time her husband left. When he returned from fishing and realized what she was doing, he sat down on the front steps and cried. But in the end, she talked him into selling his boat. The family invested in a liquor store in Monterey, and they're still here. Beyond the economic, Sicilian women made a collective decision in the 1930s to counter the pressure of Americanization that necessarily involved intermarriage with Mexican, Portuguese, Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese Americans among the workers with whom they shared neighborhoods and space in Monterey. They denied this, insisting that Italian culture always required arranged marriages and insularity from the first moment of arrival. But their marriage records proved otherwise. Throughout the early years of migration, in the teens and the 20s, Italian young people of both sexes were marrying outside the group at very high rates, just like everyone else in multiracial, multi-ethnic, working class communities in California. Sicilian women, thus, had real work to do in Monterey to keep that from continuing, which they were collectively invested in doing. This was in stark contrast to Sicilian communities elsewhere in nearby agricultural areas like Salinas or Gilroy and Morgan Hill, where my family settled. And young people just married whomever they pleased. Sicilian women in this fishing community consciously worked to build a community out of disparate immigrants who came from rival villages in Sicily, starting with arranged marriages well into the 1960s, both within the community, from nearby fishing towns in California, and once immigration law changed in their favor in the post-war, from Sicilian fishing villages too. In Monterey, it was family to family. That is how we got along, I was told unequivocally. They also created this woman's world of networks around the Catholic Church, San Carlos Church, prayer groups celebrating the Virgin Mary, craft groups, and most important, seized on the Santa Rosalia Festival, which brought everyone together in common purpose to cement their identity as Sicilians. Santa Rosalia was not commonly celebrated in the villages they came from. St. Joseph's Festa was the preferred one. But Santa Rosalia was a woman, and it was a woman-centered event honoring the guardian of fishermen. It was a way of bringing all of these diverse immigrant fishing people together in a common expression of shared identity in America and in Monterey. The community depended on and circled around this intensive activity by women. They really made it into this women's world. Santa Rosalia was political too, but not in the conventional definition of politics. It wasn't about voting or running for office. It was about organizing. And it was grassroots. There was food and music, and boats were decorated, and you saw a picture of that. Tens of thousands of Sicilians and Italians from all over California came to Monterey to celebrate with them. But most importantly, hundreds of women dressed in these long white gowns took over the streets of Monterey, claiming it as their own, making their formidable presence felt. By the 30s, when Sicilians really made up 1/3 of Monterey's population, they wanted Monterey to know it. It was women on parade, one woman said, and she described her nonna dressed in a long white gown with a hat ordering everybody around, and how wonderful it felt to see her grandmother doing such a thing. World War II derailed them. The reality in this other view of Monterey in the 30s and 40s also challenges Steinbeck's portrayal of this place as a world in which groups got along seamlessly with little attention to race or ethnicity. In fact, in Steinbeck's Monterey, Li Chong, the Chinese grocer, wields considerable social and economic power among this ragtag group of men centered around Doc's lab. Not so here. For the Sicilians, ethnicity mattered very much and was always connected to place. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, gender roles reversed, and men in families assumed the primary and very public role of defending the group as patriotic Americans, even though both women and men had supported Mussolini and were very proud of his conquests. They sent their wedding rings back to Italy, just like every other Italian enclave in the country did. It was a bittersweet time in the Italian community, one narrator told me. We were the majority in town, and we were a tight community. We were all patriotic Americans. However, many of them, mostly the nonnas, the grandmothers, failed to go through the process of naturalization and citizenship. So they were designated enemy aliens and forced to leave the coast after FDR's Executive Order 9066 included them in the wholesale roundup and incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans. But it was scattershot. Many just moved to San Francisco, unclear on the concept of moving away from the coast, and many more to Salinas, where they were not exactly welcomed. One man said, "We went to live in Salinas. It was not easy. Wherever I went for work, I was asked if I was Italian descent. I was turned down every time, although I was a natural-born American. This was very disturbing. I finally found employment at the Salinas Fairgrounds as a carpenter, building a prison camp for the Japanese." There was no solidarity here, much less compassion expressed for the natural-born Japanese Americans who were also falsely targeted by the American government as enemies of the state. There was just this sense of bitterness and hostility. Again, it became clear that they viewed themselves as white and were deeply offended at the connection to anyone they considered racially inferior in the American context. They held on to whiteness for dear life, whereas Steinbeck championed the cause of Japanese Americans and even led a campaign here in Monterey after the war years to welcome them back to his home in Salinas and Monterey. But for the Italians, it was fierce. One person said the only thing we felt bad about was why did we have to move out of town? The Italians didn't do anything. We didn't hurt anybody. It was the Japs that did it. Another narrator recalled, there was this Japanese kid that sat next to me in school, and one day he was gone. I didn't care. The truth is, we all sort of said good riddance. So I interviewed people in the 1990s. And at that time, narrators uniformly told me that their removal by executive order was hurtful, it was inconvenient, but it was quickly repaired when the order was rescinded, at least for them, 6 months later when Italy joined the Allies. However, by the time my book was published in 2006, the renewed attention to Italians and Germans affected by that executive order led many of them to change their stories from one of inconvenience to severe trauma. So, you know, once again, the limits of oral history as historical evidence here. In conclusion, the post-war led to a replenishment of immigration from the original Sicilian fishing villages after immigration opened up in with the Immigration Act of 1965. It also led to increased rates of returns too. So in my field work, I was surprised and, you know, envisioned all those nonas, all those grandmothers rolling over in their graves to see their 30-something grandchildren, especially granddaughters, returning to live in the fishing villages, now resort towns like Monterey, that they had left some 50 years earlier. Most importantly, we can appreciate in this moment, in this post-war, how prescient and adaptive and nimble these women were. And I'm glad to talk a little bit more about that. Fishing is still important in Monterey, but it is no longer this industrialized zone, Cannery Row. After the sardines disappeared in the 1950s, Cannery Row went through a metamorphosis of sorts, first decaying through the 60s and 70s, beset by fires in the cannery, some of, you know, questionable origin, and targeted by environmentalists for destroying the coastline and the fisheries. But then Cannery Row reemerges in 1984 with the internationally famous Monterey Bay Aquarium as a bona fide tourist mecca. So those Sicilian women's investments in restaurants and real estate and retail really paid off for them by the 1980s. As we celebrate Steinbeck's genius 75 years later, we also bear in mind that his view was his view, that even though he didn't see them, the world of Cannery Row, first and foremost, was a world peopled, even defined by these strong, creative, brave, powerful, working-class immigrant women, many of whom were Sicilian. Thank you. Bruce, I leave it to you to collect the questions, and maybe we can do another shared screen and revisit those pictures.
We have some questions, Carol. We can get started on it. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So the first question comes from James. And he says, well, you know, reading Steinbeck's letters to his publishers, I'm not sure he liked women. Look at his portrayal, liked women. Look at his portrayal of Kathy in East of Eden.
Yeah.
So would it be a surprise that in both Cannery Row and Tortilla Flat, the women played a secondary role? Were you surprised when you did your research, or does it make sense in the context that he's talking about that this was a distorted view of the role of women?
I think Kathy is about the most evil person, evil character I've ever read about. I wasn't surprised, but I really understood the visceral reaction to Steinbeck and why he was despised. I wasn't surprised at all because I grew up among very strong and powerful Sicilian women, and I wasn't doing research in reaction only to Steinbeck, but also to the portrayal of Italian immigration that tended to ignore women altogether as part of the process of immigration and settlement. So I'm not alone, and this is not original, but there were a whole group of scholars doing research on Italian immigration, especially Southern Italian women, to claim them not as passively standing behind their fathers and husbands and brothers, but as actors in their own right in the whole process of immigration and settlement. I wasn't surprised, but I was surprised to hear words like matriarchy. That was a little much. I thought, well, that's pretty extreme. And I would argue that that's not really true, but oh well, that's what they said. Mostly their sons said that. Yeah. And when I was doing my work, a lot of families, all the boys would go to their mother's house religiously every Sunday. They spent time with their mama. And I kind of thought that was a good thing.
So we have a question from Catherine that says, what is your current project regarding Salinas?
Thank you for asking, Catherine. I'm doing a study in Salinas that does not focus on an ethnic group. It's an urban history of Salinas beginning beginning with the native people, but then moving through the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century in the context of urban California. And I think that right now we have a lot of understanding of what happened in California urban life with the big municipalities and the big metropolitan areas, but agricultural regions have not been studied so much. And if they have, they've been studied really with a focus on a specific ethnic group. So I aim in this study to look at Salinas more comprehensively and to look at it not just from an angle of labor or ethnicity, but to bring it into an understanding of urban life in a rural region. It is the county seat, it is the center, and probably the most important, it is the largest city in the Central Coast region. So for that, it deserves some attention. I'm almost finished, I'm on the last chapter.
Okay, so we've got 2 questions from Michael. The first one is, you mentioned 4 women supervising the lines, but I thought the photos had 4 men, i.e. men supervising the lines. Can you speak about the supervision and the relationship between men and women in that context?
That's a good question, and you're absolutely right. It wasn't just women who supervised, but the women who were appointed supervisors tended to be women who could identify as white women. So Mexican women were not being, promoted in that way, and they were pretty powerful and pretty ruthless, and used their positions to reward favorites and punish others. So there was a lot of resentment in the workplace about the role of 4 ladies. And I think Vicki Ruiz does a great job in her book, Cannery Lives, when she talks about that in the San Jose Canneries, that it was a workplace in which the workers were Mexican, Filipino, Italian, but the 4 ladies were all Italian women, and they wielded power. They were pretty dominant in terms of the modicum of power that they had, they used.
So Michael also asks, well, you spoke of the importance of white identity to the Sicilians, but how did they become white? Did they become white on arrival, or was it a process of transformation?
And that is the title of a great book by Tom Guglielmo. But they were white by law. They were white by law. And in California, anyone of European origin was treated as white, right? Because in California, we're living in a very multiracial state. It was unusually so. And the presence of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and multiple Asian groups meant that any European origin people would be treated as they were white. So here we see Irish Americans and Italian Americans immediately considered mainstream. Whereas if you lived in Chicago, they were not quite accepted until World War II. And after World War II, at the federal level, the government sort of eclipsed all of those racial categories that had been so important in the early part of the century, and considered everyone that was hyphenated white if you were of European origin. So that's when the real cultural transition happened. The legal point was that they were always considered white by law. Not always treated that way, but certainly more in places like California than in places like Chicago or Philadelphia.
So we have a question from actually another professor at Stanford, Greg Roston. He asks, how many women actually participated in the labor force in the 30s? You might break that down. Was it higher among the Sicilians than the other ethnic groups?
You know, that was a really tough one. It was hard to count heads because of the disappearance of records when those canneries were burnt. And so I never could get a handle on how many. That's the million-dollar question here. But it was pretty much of a mixed workplace. This was definitely a multi-ethnic workforce. I don't want to argue that Sicilian women were the only workers. There was a really strong presence of Filipinos and Mexican Americans, of other Asian groups, Chinese and Japanese, although they kind of sorted out by work. So Japanese tended to focus on the abalone. And Chinese had their own kind of separate community. They all participated in the canneries, but Sicilians numerically dominated because they numerically dominated Monterey's population. But, you know, I tore my hair out trying to get the numbers because the canneries if they did keep numbers, they didn't keep them for posterity. They really disappeared. I looked at one man who was a labor organizer. I hoped that he could give me the records, but he didn't have them either. So, you know, unfortunately.
So in the literature about ethnic communities that come over to work, particularly say with the Mexican American community, it's common for the men to come over as sole workers, and then only later for the families to reunite. What happened here? Is it did the Sicilians come over right from the start with their family, and if so, is this different from the other groups that they were working with in the cannery?
It's deceptive. It's deceptive, right? Because when we see male workers, we assume they made this decision all by themselves. They did not. There were family strategies. So when we see Mexican American men coming over to work, we need to understand that the family got together and made that kind of a decision. That gender always played a role in migration decisions, even if it's not visible to us. And sometimes it made sense to send a woman first. If she was young and strong and she could make some money and send it back to her family, it depended on the family situation. Most commonly, the people who were the most the best bet of finding work and could be on their own for a limited period of time were young men. But that didn't mean that those decisions were made by them all by themselves. They were made in family conferences, and women didn't just go to join men. They had agendas of their own. Either they were going to find, complete a family circle, or they were going to find work for families left behind. So I think that what we've learned about immigration history is that it's a complicated story. And if we just look at the surface, we don't really see how interconnected it all was and how gender matters so much. So the matriarch of the family could be telling someone to go. That doesn't mean she didn't have power or that he was going all by himself, in other words. And often, whether it was a young man or young woman or whoever went, they didn't come and live by themselves. They came to someone. So we see these complicated receiving networks too. And sometimes they came with the intention of returning, sometimes not. Things were so dire in Sicily in the early 20th century that most families intended to one by one relocate because there just didn't seem to be any point in staying.
Mhm. Carol, there are a bunch of people that don't have questions, but have written very nice things or suggestions of other studies. So hopefully Marco can hold, type out or save those for you. But I want to
Okay.
stick with the questions for the sake
Okay.
of keeping it interesting to everybody. Um, uh, so one question that comes up here is, are there one or two women that really stand out? And I think probably this questioner would like to sort of see if they can follow up on it or read more about it. But are there one or two women that really sort of exemplify a lot of what you're talking about that you think deserve special focus?
I just, I really did fall in love when I did this. I did. Lucy Gruel stood out to me in her 90s, Catherine Cardinale, Anita Ferranti. They, I became very close. And that was very difficult because you're trying to write a dissertation, you're trying to write a critical analysis of a community. It's hard when you do fall in love. It almost can't be helped. But I so admired their strength and their power in the face of a world that was pretty hostile, that didn't really think that they were worth very much, I admired so much their accomplishment without education or without means. They had no means to do what they did. They really did. And Lucy was, unfortunately in a tough situation at home, but she scrimped and saved and bought a house by herself. How do you do that? I just had so much admiration for so many. And now that you say that, in my mind's eye, I'm just seeing, I can't pick out anybody in particular because they were all so important to me. Nancy Mangiapane, oh my gosh, there were just so many.
Um, so here's a question. You refer over and over again that most of them were Sicilians. Was there any division between Sicilians and other Italians, or did
Oh
they
yeah.
get, okay, talk a little bit about that then.
Okay, it got a little ugly. So one woman who ended up being on the Monterey City Council was still upset in the 1990s because she didn't get to march in the Santa Rosalia parade because her family was not from Sicily. Our own Leon Panetta's family is not Sicilian. Yes, there was a very, very deep division. That kind of ends during World War II. Because during World War II, there is a kind of relaxing of those rigid barriers between Sicilians and non-Sicilians. That war really, you hate to think of a war as the pivotal turning point, but in some ways it was, because suddenly it was a lot more relaxed. It was a lot more important to become more American. It was kind of okay to marry outside the group. And there were lots more returns after that. So yes, it was a very big marker, and Sicilians in Monterey still will identify as Sicilian. I went to an event in the early 2000s at the Italian Catholic Federation, and the whole conversation was whether they should call their group Italian or Sicilian. And the conversation lasted over an hour. So it's still a matter of pride and support. In Italy, region is everything. Yeah.
So here's a question. What's your view of Cannery Row today? I mean, it seems like you called it I guess a tourist mecca, and
Yep.
do you feel like it's a positive retelling of of what happened in the past, or do you feel like it's too commercialized? Is essentially what's being asked here.
everybody would say it's too commercialized. I don't feel that way. I think when you walk down Foam Street or you walk down Cannery Row, yes, it's commercialized. But there are also all these little remnants of Cannery Row. I don't think it's such a terrible thing. And Steinbeck actually wrote about this. He said, you know, let's not criticize this resurgence because there's always resurgence. Cannery Row, we shouldn't be so nostalgic for something that had its time and place. And before Cannery Row, you know, this was a fishing village too. So we need to look at all those incarnations as what they are. They're transformations that people make for a variety of reasons. And you know, and now, of course, in the COVID epidemic, the whole tourist industry in Monterey is suffering. So it may be reincarnated again into something else. I don't feel pain when I see that. It is what it is, and we just accept.
Now, Lynn asked the following question. She said, you said that one interviewee felt that Steinbeck ruined the community. What do you think she meant by that?
I heard that a lot because he portrayed it as this lazy, sort of marginalized workplace, and they saw industrialization as a good thing, as a beautiful thing. Not at, and they didn't like the fact that he portrayed them, the people of Monterey, as this kind of collection of lackadaisical, lazy people on the margins. And that's basically what people objected to. That, you know, and I don't know. Nobody liked Steinbeck until they loved Steinbeck. So all over the peninsula, he was not the favorite person until quite recently. He's now accepted and renowned. And even though he won a Pulitzer, even though he was he's an icon, but in the context of his own place, he was treated not so well. And that includes Salinas too. So we see a resurgence of interest in Steinbeck. We see more of an acceptance of his view as his view. And I think that that's the important thing. He wasn't wrong. He just had his view. And it was different from the view from the cannery floor.
So we're coming up on our time limit, so I'm going to put the two last questions if you could answer. One has to do with if there's still a persistence of the, and again, using the term in quotation marks, matriarchy of Sicilian families in Monterey. Is it still that case, or has that changed? And then there's a question about Doc Ricketts' lab and whether it's, there's a commitment to keep it going, or what do you know about the status of that? So those will be the last two questions.
Okay, so yes, Sicilian families are still centered on women and families and nonas. And Doc Ricketts' lab turned into a place where people gathered for, entertainment. In fact, one of my good friends' parents were part of that transformation of the lab into a kind of a club for old-time Montereyans. And those kinds of structures are public history structures. And they're often the subject of great debate. Do we tear them down? Do we preserve them? Where's the money going to come from? So it still exists. A lot of the houses on Cannery Row are still there. There are some things that are unchanged. And it's a matter of public debate and money.
Do women go out on the boats these days? If in the
oh yes, yes. Women are fishermen.
But they didn't in those days, I assume.
No.
Okay.
No.
Well,
that
Carol,
was what meant.
Yeah. So Carol, you'll have to look at these comments yourself. You'll see a lot of people really enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank
and thought you
you.
did an excellent job. And so there's a lot of interesting people. You brought out a lot of people talking about their own experiences growing up in that area. So you might
Oh,
want to
goody.
put them down. You might want to put them down as potential interviewees. So again,
For
work
book
with
number
Marco.
2.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
postscript. The
Yeah, so
postscript.
what
I
I
will.
would do is take a look at all these questions yourself. You may want to respond to some of them offline, but I just want to say thank you very much for this. This was a great talk, and
Thank
we're
you.
going to continue to try to do more series on communities across California for certain, but we'd also like to expand to do some more communities in the West, finding about people who've done some writing on this. So we're going to keep doing this, and in the meantime, thank you, Carol. And if people want to get in touch with you, they can certainly email you,
Yes.
and everybody will look for that next book coming out, which
Thank
you
you.
hope
No
will be in a
pressure
year or
there,
so.
huh?
Yeah, yeah.
No pressure.
Okay. Thank you very
Thank you
much,
so
and
much.
thank
It's
you to
been
everybody for joining us. Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye.